Property binding is how we can pass data from something like a component class into a template by binding it to a particular element. At the moment, all we've done is simply print out in the HTML the title Ultimate Angular. However, what we actually want to do is probably bind something that the user can change, and this would include something like an input. Now, first, to understand what these curly braces are actually doing, they're actually called something called sugar syntax. Sugar syntax is an easier way of doing something that looks cleaner. So to demonstrate this, what we'll actually do is wrap this title in an h1 tag. Now, the sugar syntax will take over and automatically put the title inside of the h1. All this is doing is basically setting the inner HTML or the text content for this particular element. So we can actually delete this entirely if we want to. Now, in plain JavaScript, you may have accessed a particular DOM node and done element.innerHTML equals something. We have this same capability in Angular. So we can do inner HTML and then equals the title. Now, this won't actually work on its own because Angular needs to bind to a property. The way that we do this is using a square bracket notation around the property name that we want to bind to. And we do this because it indicates a one-way data flow syntax. So the data comes down from the class, binds to the template, and it looks at this property inner HTML and it will set the inner HTML content. And just to show that this actually works, we'll actually create our original example underneath. So we'll do title, and we're going to have a look at this in the browser. So here you can see that we have Ultimate Angular and Ultimate Angular. So by using property binding, Angular is actually looking up the JavaScript properties and binding to them specifically. Let's look at another example. One addition I've got here is I've added an image folder with a logo.svg inside. Now let's assume that we want to add an image tag. All we need to do here is create a source property, and we need to reference the actual image itself. So what we're going to call this one is logo. It's going to be a string, and we're going to give it a value. So it's going to be image/logo.svg because it's in the image folder. Now to bind this, we might think that you do something like this. However, we've just learned that we want to dynamically bind to the actual source. So underneath, Angular needs to know that you want to bind to the source property. If you think in plain JavaScript terms, this would be something like element.source equals logo.svg. This is essentially the equivalent of what we're doing here in the actual template. So when we go over to the browser, you can see here that we have this Ultimate Angular logo, and it's being bound via Angular. We want to do this because we can dynamically change this source of the logo if we want to. In a normal application, you might have a user input, and they may be able to press a button, and it may be able to change the source of an image. So using this square bracket notation allows us to bind to an image tag and inform Angular that we need to bind to the source property of the actual element. Another example we'll do is with an input. Now we'll give this one a type of text. How do we bind to this? If we want to set an initial value, we can say something like Todd. However, we're going to make this dynamic. So what we'll do here is create a name, and we'll say it's of type string, and we'll just give it a name of Todd. Now in the template, I can say value equals name, and again, we need to bind to the property of value. So if you think elements.value equals Todd, that's exactly what's happening underneath. So we're binding to the particular property on the element. Let's go and check this out in the browser. And here we have our element with the initial value of Todd that's been set. So this is called property binding, and it ties in nicely with the one-way data flow. When we start to build out our custom components during the duration of this course, this will actually make much more sense because we can actually create custom properties on our custom components. To demonstrate that this is actually one-way data flow, we can take this name value here that we're binding. If we use an expression, we can say name in the view, and you may be thinking, as I type in the input itself, that this value is going to be updated as well. So with one-way data flow, that's not the case. As we'll learn as we go through this course more about one-way data flow, when we come to creating our own custom components, this will make much more sense. So here we have the value of Todd. The value of Todd has been bound to the input. I can type my surname motto, and nothing here has been updated. This is using pure one-way data binding. And you can test this out on other elements such as a video element, an audio element, a div tag, a h1 tag, an input, a radio box, and you can see what properties that you can bind to. Anything that doesn't exist, Angular will throw an error in the console and say cannot bind to this specific property because it doesn't exist.